a really good video that kind of explains all of them in detail. And we're going to look at that video. But before we do, I think it's important to go over one of the most specific and significant contract changes right now. And that is that the addendum regarding broker's fees has gone away. That confusing form that a lot of us really didn't understand how to fill out right, or some people would fill out and inadvertently ask for 6% without knowingly asking for 6%, has gone away. And a lot of us brokers said, well, we need a way to bind the seller to pay the buyer's brokerage that is in the contract, not an addendum. So what TXR has done and what Trek has done is they've updated paragraph 12. Now, some of you guys might be real familiar with this because as of January 3rd, all of this stuff is mandatory. So if you go to your zip forms now, these new contracts are there. The new verbiage is there, the new literature is there, and it's ready to go. So the addendum regarding broker's fees is gone, and they've basically incorporated it into paragraph 12 of the 1-to-4 family contract. Now, here's what it looks like, ladies and gentlemen. So the old paragraph 12 used to just have some literature in regards to concessions that the seller could pay in reference to the buyer's loan. And there was never any verbiage in here that said that the seller could pay concessions in conjunction with the brokerage fees that the buyer owes their broker. Now, if we have a compensation agreement between brokers, meaning we've called the listing agent, and I'm acting like we are representing the buyer here. We've called the listing agent and we said, hey, are you guys offering cooperative compensation? And they've said yes. Let's just say it's 3%, and our buyer's rep says 3%. And the buyer said, I want to make a part of negotiations. I don't want to pay it myself. I want you to try to get the seller to pay it. Um, and we're able to get that out of the listing broker in a compensation agreement between brokers. We don't need to fill this out. We've already got it. This is purely if the listing agent is not offering cooperative compensation, can we ask the seller to pay us directly? So it's paying our compensation from the seller instead of the listing broker. And there's a couple ways we can use this. Let's just say the compensation agreement between brokers is only for 2%. And our buyer's representation agreement says 3%. Well, that means that the buyer still owes us 1%. Well, we can ask for the 1% here as well if the buyer elects to make it a part of negotiations. So this is awesome. Now, how it reads is it basically says the following expenses must be paid at or prior to closing. Seller shall pay the following expenses: seller's expenses, releases of existing liens, including prepayment penalties and recording fees, release of seller's loan liability tax statements or certificates, preparation of deed, 1/2 of escrow fee, brokerage fees that seller has agreed to pay, and other expenses payable by seller under this contract. So that's paragraph 12A1A. Now, paragraph 12A1B states the following amount to be applied to brokerage fees that buyer has agreed to pay. And we're going to check a box and we're going to say it's either a flat fee or we check the box that say it's a percentage of the sales price. And an amount not to exceed blank to be applied towards buyer's expenses. So 12A1B is basically the buyer's brokerage fee. 12A1C can be applied towards the buyer's expenses at closing, such as the loan expenses and things like that. Now, it's important to remember here that just as it was previously with concessions, we still can't go above what the lender will allow the buyer to receive in total max concessions from the seller. Okay. So FHA is usually about 6% of the sales price. You go above that, let's just say we got 4% in 12A 1B, then we got another 3% in 12A1C, well, that's going to be 7%. So we're not going to be able to get that extra 1% because the lender says, no, we want the buyer to have some skin in the game. We are putting a cap on the maximum allowable concessions that we're going to allow this borrower to receive from the seller. So that's always been something that we've always known about, but it's always been in reference to concessions in conjunction with the buyer's loan. Now, this paragraph also is referencing concessions in conjunction with the buyer's brokerage fees
Recording in progress.
that the buyer owes. I'm going to go ahead and mute Suzette there. So all of us have been waiting for this because basically the addendum regarding broker's fees was an emergency document that TXR had put together to adhere to the NAR settlement practice changes. One of our pet peeves was, well, what happens when we send that over and they sign the contract, but they inadvertently lose the addendum? It's best to have it within the actual contract, and this is the spot that we can ask for it now. Both buyer and seller sign this document. They initial this document. It's within the negotiations of the agreement. So we have been waiting for this. We have it now, and it's going to make our life a lot easier and a little bit more simplistic than dealing with the addendum regarding broker's fees. That is what I feel is one of the most significant changes to the 1-to-4 family contract. Now, we're going to be going over some other changes as well within our TXR video, but I really wanted to hit home that if you guys haven't logged into Zip Forms and went over this, basically this is an example here. This is the red line version, meaning the red language has been stricken from the contract and the blue language is what they've inputted into the contract. So I'm in love with it. I think this is going to make our lives a lot easier if there is any easiness to this NAR post-settlement practice change that we're dealing with. But we wanted it within the contract, and now we got it within the contract. And we can utilize it two ways. We can utilize it to pay all the brokerage fees that the buyer owes us, or we can utilize it to pay some of the brokerage fees that the buyer owes us. It really just depends on if the listing agent is offering cooperative compensation and how much that cooperative compensation is. And does it match the commission that's stated in our buyer's representation agreement already? So before we jump into the video, I really want to see if anybody had any questions about this, ladies and gentlemen. Does anybody have any questions about this?
I have a question, Shiaki.
Yeah, go right ahead, Monica.
I just got an offer on this new form
Okay.
and she included the compensation form,
Okay.
but she also check marked 12B and put 3%.
So in the compensation agreement, what's the amount of the commission in the compensation agreement?
3%. So the seller is agreeing to pay 3%.
Yeah.
I told her that, so that she's just doing duplicate work, right?
Right. That is potentially creating two obligations for the seller there.
Right.
Basically, what they're doing is you've already
It's
agreed to
just one
pay
or
them.
the other. You don't need to do both.
Exactly. Yeah, the way it is if you already got a compensation agreement, there's no reason to fill this out, especially if the compensation agreement is exactly the amount that's in the buyer's rep agreement. So that was the problem that we were having with the addendum regarding broker's fees as well, is agents were filling out paragraph D2B, which created a new obligation for the seller that the seller pay directly, let's just say, for example purposes, 3%, and there was already a compensation agreement in place. So in essence, they're asking for 6% commission, if you
Right.
want to think about it that way. They're getting 3% from the listing broker, which is you, and then they're asking the seller to pay for
Right.
3%.
That's what I thought.
And I
Okay.
can assume that they just don't understand that they're doing that,
Right.
and that's what we're running into. A lot of buyers agents don't understand, or they haven't been trained up properly, and they're just filling everything out because they want to make sure they get paid, and then they inadvertently ask for 6%.
That's what
And,
I
and
thought.
that also brings up another problem that all of us have to be aware of as listing agents. We got to make sure that we don't bind our seller to this.
Right.
If you let the seller sign off on this and they want to bring it that far, they can and say, no, no, you got to pay us 6%. You signed the documents, you signed the compensation agreement, and the seller signed the contract where paragraph 12 said that they were going to pay 3% as well. So as listing agents, we got to make sure we protect our sellers. And if we're already offering the 3% in cooperative compensation via the compensation agreement between brokers, then, paragraph 12A1B should be blank.
Exactly.
We
That's what
really
I
need to check that. We need to check that. And, obviously, if they filled it out, what I would do in this regard,
make sure there's an NA in there.
yeah, make sure there's an NA in there. Maybe give them a invitation to submit a new and put, that you take this stuff out or write NA there, whatever you want to do. But yeah, that's one of the problems that we were running into with the identity regarding broker fees.
Because
And
technically the buyer's not paying it. The listing agent, the seller is paying it through the listing agent.
right, right. Well, basically the compensation agreement between brokers is, hey, we're getting paid from the listing
Yeah,
brokerage.
because
Obviously,
paragraph
the seller's
B
paying
is
that.
not correct. Paragraph B says the buyer has agreed to pay it, and that's not correct in my
Yeah.
in the transaction.
Right, exactly. Well, paragraph B basically says that the following amount to be applied towards broker's fees that buyer has agreed to pay. So that's in reference to the buyer's rep agreement.
Oh,
You
by yeah, true.
they're
Okay.
referencing that. Good question. Susan, you got a question, young lady?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
So
so
if the
I just
listing
had,
agent is agreeing to pay the buyer's agent out of their commission, then the only document that's required is that 2402 compensation between brokers. That's correct, I think?
That's correct. This is the
And
only
what if,
document that you would need right here. Is
okay,
that
and so what if they are willing to pay more than what you have in your buyer's rep agreement?
then the proper thing to do is to go back and amend that buyer's rep to whatever that amount is. Because
Okay,
one of the TXR rules is we've got to disclose what we're making, right? And we can't be making more than what is in that buyer's rep agreement. So if we go back and we amend it, we're good.
okay,
Yeah, we're good at that point. But I mean, and I don't want to say always if you got a compensation agreement that should be blank, because let's just say the listing broker is only offering 2%. Okay. If the listing broker is only offering 2% and our buyer's rep says 3%, and we have a talk with the buyer and the buyer says, I don't want to pay that additional 1%. Can you ask the seller to pay for it? Then we could potentially be using a compensation agreement and paragraph 12 asking for that additional 1% right here. Does that make sense? So it really depends on what the amount of cooperative compensation is that is in the compensation agreement between brokers, and does that match our buyer's rep? Is that the exact amount in our buyer's rep? Any other questions?
yes, I do. I have a question. I just
Yeah, go
came
ahead,
up,
Suzette.
okay, so I just came up against this and it was very confusing. So in 12A-B, we just put the 3% because it's also at the bottom of the contract. I'm just very confused about it because when I filled it out, I put 3%. And that's just where you're asking the broker to pay you, not the seller, correct?
No, this is where you're asking the seller to pay right here in the actual 104 family contract.
Okay.
This is where we're asking the seller to pay us.
Okay, so the one at the bottom, when you put the 3% there as well. So the other agent told me that I was asking for 6% total by having it in both places. So they removed it from the A1B, and then I did a broker agreement through them for my compensation, but I also left it 3% at the bottom of the contract where it has always been.
So you talking on page 10 right
Yeah.
here. Wait, with this okay.
Yes.
You guys got to understand that this right here is purely informational. It doesn't bind anybody. This is purely
Okay.
informational. So I think that they were incorrect in telling you that, Suzette, because
Okay.
it basically says disclosure pursuant to previous separate agreement. Listing broker has agreed to pay other brokers. So they were just referencing a compensation agreement. And I think what happened there is the listing broker said, hey, wait a minute, we're offering cooperative compensation. So we want to take it out of paragraph 12, and let's put together a compensation agreement between brokers. And they're just referencing whatever that is here. Nobody actually signs this page, and that's
Right.
why it's considered purely informational. You know, this page is most of the time what this page is meant for is the title companies to understand the breakdown if they're not getting a CDA from the buyer's broker or something like that.
Okay. So if I do a broker to broker compensation agreement, then I don't have to fill out 12A,
And
B.
that is correct. That is
Okay.
correct. And
Okay.
even if you had this compensation agreement, this compensation agreement brokers filled out, and this was blank, you're
Yeah.
still getting paid what's in here because this is purely informational. All it is referencing what's already in the compensation agreement.
Okay. So basically, let me just see if I got this. The compensation agreement between brokers really needs to be filled out all the time because unless the seller is paying me directly, like if they have it listed for sale by owner, then that's where that would come in.
Correct. You know, for sale by owner would be something that instead of a compensation agreement between brokers, it would be
Right.
something called a compensation agreement between broker and owner. That's what
Right.
you'd have to fill out. It looks very similar to
Right.
compensation
And
agreement between
I've
broker.
seen that, but I guess I'm confused as to when and why we fill out 12, section 12,
Well,
B.
so the times that you would fill out 12B is if they are not offering cooperative compensation. If we're not getting it out of the listing broker, the listing broker says, no, no,
Okay.
no. The seller's paying me, and I expect the buyer's agent to pay you. And we tell our buyer's agent that, and they say, hey, I want to make it part of negotiations. Well, then
Right.
this is where we can bind the seller to pay us directly, where because we don't have a compensation agreement because the listing broker has said we're not offering cooperative compensation, if that
Okay.
makes sense.
It makes perfect sense now.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much.
No,
And then,
absolutely.
on
And what
C,
can
that's
get confusing and,
yeah,
and, and
because especially the way it's worded was
right.
extremely confusing to
And
me.
I think it's going to be a process, guys. Like they've already said, hey, let's get rid of this addendum regarding broker's fees. It's causing way too much problems, you know?
Yeah.
But I don't want to necessarily say if we have a compensation agreement that 12A 1B is not filled out because, like I said, if the compensation agreement between brokers doesn't match what we're getting in the buyer's rep, we can still get the compensation agreement between brokers, say it's only 2%, or buyer's rep says 3%, and we can still fill out paragraph 12, A1B, and ask for the additional 1% right here from the seller directly.
Okay, that makes sense. And then C is where we ask for closing costs and such.
That's right. That's just the regular old concessions, what we're always used to. The regular old concessions in conjunction with buyer's closing costs, lender fees, and things like that.
Right. Like so, and then one more question, then I'm done, I promise.
No,
So
no, no,
on
hey, that's why we're here, guys. Ask away.
So on B again, let's say they're offering or they verbally said they're doing a bonus. Is that where we put a bonus in?
So we're talking bonus. No,
I mean, I haven't come across that yet, but
well,
like let's say the seller says, well, if you bring me a contract and we'll pay you 3% and I'm offering a $5,000 bonus. Is that where you would put the bonus? Because
you
you can't
could.
really put it on the compensation agreement, can you?
Yeah, you could do that. You could do that. You could say, I've got a compensation agreement between brokers for 3%.
Mhm.
The seller is offering a $5,000 bonus, so you could actually have a compensation agreement between brokers, fill it out for 3%. And you could have the 5,000 in paragraph 12A1 coming directly from the seller for that additional $5,000 bonus.
Okay.
But if that's the case, you want to go back and amend that buyer's rep to reflect that additional $5,000 bonus because we can't make more than what's actually in the buyer's rep, if that makes sense.
Okay, including the bonus.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
bonus, even if it's a bonus, they're looking at it as commission. So if it's an addition, like if our buyer's rep says 3%, it's a $5,000 bonus on top of the 3%, then we're gonna have to go back and amend that buyer's rep to make sure we account for that extra $5,000.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Absolutely. Deidre,
What,
you have a question?
hey, the compensation agreement. Okay, so in paragraph 22 of the 1 to 4, do we have to now include it in paragraph 22?
No, ma'am. And the reason being is that agreement is between the brokers. It's a compensation agreement between the brokers, and the brokers aren't a party to this contract here, right? So
Right.
buyer and seller don't sign that agreement. You know, the listing broker and the buyer's broker signs that agreement.
Okay,
So
but does
you
it
do,
get submitted to the title company when we submit all the other documents?
um yeah, we could just to give the title company clarity on it. Most of the time the title company's going to go off our CDA though, and as long as nobody's complaining that the numbers are wrong, we're good. So but
Okay.
it'd be a good idea just to guide the closer correctly, so that they know what they're doing. Especially if we run into those scenarios where it is only 2%, we're getting the other 1% out of the seller. We want to reflect that so they do things accordingly.
Okay, thanks.
Quick comment.
Yeah, go right
So
ahead.
regarding the bonus,
Yes, sir.
it should go in paragraph 12B, AB, and listed as $500. No need for an explanation, just additional funds.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
all you gotta do is 12A1B.
Yep.
And that's what it says, the following amount to be applied to the brokerage fees that buyer has agreed to pay. And you know, if it's straight up $500, stay away from the percentage. Just check the box that says lump sum, put $500 right there. Main thing to do there though, Phil, is if that $500 is in addition to what the buyer's rep says, go back and amend that buyer's rep to reflect exactly what the commission is going to be.
Very good.
Well,
Jill?
I have a question.
go right ahead.
What if it's is there any way to ask the seller to pay when they have an extra fee for using some website for like their contract? For instance, I have a bank was selling and
Mhm.
they have some awful website and their agent hates it too. And I have to pay an extra $170 just to use this website. And then that's going to have to come out of my commission. And
Yeah.
the bank only gives a 2% commission. So I just changed my rep agreement so the buyer doesn't have to pay an extra because the bank's not going to pay it. I know. Is there any place on here to ask the seller to pay that?
Well, you could use paragraph 12A1B for that as well. I mean, I would use this lump sum and I put $175 or 200 right here. That way, the thing is that's coming back to the buyer's broker. So at least you're getting recouped that fee. And I know what you're talking about there, that administrative fee for those foreclosure websites out there. And it's like, yeah, we have to pay you to make an offer on your property. But
Yeah.
yeah, it seems very unfair. But yeah, you could utilize this paragraph for that. Absolutely, Kristen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question, Jackie.
Yeah, go right ahead, Lily.
With what you just answered her, that paragraph 12A1B does say buyer has agreed to pay. What if the listing agent put on there or let you know that the seller is willing to pay an extra bonus? Where do you put that? Because the sellers will sometimes say, we are paying you an extra such. I've seen that only a couple of times, not much.
Well, it's kind of weird how it's worded because it says the following amount to be applied to brokerage fees that buyer has agreed to pay. What that's referencing is the buyer's rep agreement, because
Okay.
the buyer has agreed to pay, let's just say 3% in the buyer's rep agreement for buyer's representation, right? So that's what that's referencing right there.
Right.
And basically what Kristen's doing is just kind of getting creative with it. And saying, I know that they're only paying 2%. Let's just say they were paying 3%, Kristen, and that's what your rep agreement said. You probably have to go back and amend it and add that extra 175. The main thing here is just making sure that we're not getting paid more than what's in that buyer's rep agreement.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. And then, first of all, is there any other questions before I go on to this next document here?
Shiaki, if we're going under that premise and there's a bonus, like let's say it's the builder is the seller, and the buyer is getting a loan, wouldn't that take us over that maximum that's allowed by the lender for buyer's expenses?
It would really depend on sales price, but maybe, the thing is, if there is a lender, we're kind of stuck at the conforming at their max amount of concessions right there. But there might be a way to throw that in the compensation agreement between brokers. Maybe that builder has a listing broker and we could throw the bonus there. That way it's not reflected in the concession section and subjected to a maximum allowable. So there's ways to get around it. We would just have to throw it into the compensation agreement instead of putting it over here in 12A1B. Now, one thing that I think is important to go over too before we take a look at all the form updates via the TXR video is this is paragraph 5A. I'm sorry, just paragraph 5 of the new listing agreement, the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. Okay. This is what's giving us all trouble right here, right? Because you've got two ways to pay the listing broker. Now, 5A, something we're always used to, right? 5A is broker's fee with compensation for other broker. And we would fill it out going, this paragraph 5A includes payment compensation to the other broker working with buyer. It says complete both 1 and 2. When earned and payable, seller will pay broker. Usually we'll put 6% there. And then down here, let's see here. If broker does not pay the other broker that procures a buyer as specified in paragraph 5A2, broker's fee in this paragraph 5A1 will be reduced by an amount not paid to the other broker. So you know how we always worried about, well, that listing agent got that, they got that the buyer themselves, and now they're getting both sides. Well, they can't do that anymore here because this is saying broker's fee with compensation means this is how much you get, Mr. Listing Broker, and then the cooperative compensation that you're going to share with the buyer's broker. So that's pretty good that they can't double dip there. But what I wanted to get to was we're used to 5A. 5A has always been in our contract. That's what we're used to in our listing agreements, that we charge the seller 6% and then we break off 3% or some of that, or charge them 5%, we break off 2% or 3%, or whatever we do as cooperative compensation to the buyer's broker. The spot that's new that we're all having trouble with is 5B. And this is broker's fee without compensation for other broker. That means the seller pays us and that's it. There's no cooperative compensation going to the other broker. Now, when you're at listing appointments and you're going over this, you almost have to think that this is an attorney trying to trip us up. That's how safe we have to be right now. So the best way that I can come up with to explain this is, you know what, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, that's your right to only pay me without offering cooperative compensation to the buyer's broker. But if you choose to do that, you will be pushing affordability away from 50% of the buyers in our market. My job is to get this property sold, and I do not want my buyer pool shrinking by 50%. That is a better way to explain it than to tell them, well, if you don't offer cooperative compensation, nobody's going to show the property and it's never going to get sold. That's another lawsuit waiting to happen if somebody says that. Okay. So the best way to explain this to the seller is, that's your right, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. You got every right to only pay me without offering cooperative compensation to the buyer's broker. But if you choose to do that, you will be pushing affordability away from 50% of the buyers in our market. And I don't want to start this listing out by shrinking our buyer pool by 50%. Now, most of us, we've had no problems with this. Even other brokerages, they've had no problems with this. I haven't seen too many listing firms that are not offering cooperative compensation. You know, I think we've adjusted to this pretty good. But I think it's important to explain to you guys how to explain it to a seller. You know, you don't want to say, you don't offer it, nobody's going to show it, it's not going to get sold. You don't want to say that. So the tactful way to say it is, it's your right. You got the right to only pay me and not pay cooperative compensation to the buyer's broker. But if you choose to do that, you will be pushing affordability away from about 50% of buyers in our market. That gets them to think, wow, well, I don't want to lose 50% of my buyer pool. I agree. Let's go ahead and offer cooperative compensation. So I'm going to go ahead and roll this video because these are the general counsel of TXR put together a really good video on all the contract form changes. And it's not only a 1 to 4. We've got stuff in the third party. We've got stuff in the backup addendum. They made changes to a lot of stuff. And we're recording this Zoom today and we're emailing it to all of you guys. So you've got a copy that you can go back and reference. But TXR did a great job putting together this video and explaining these changes in detail. Any more questions before we take a look at that video, though? Okay. All right. Well, let me go ahead and stop the screen share here and let's do this. Everybody see my screen? Yeah. Okay, great.
Hi, I'm Kelsey Vanderbilt, Associate Counsel at Texas Realtors.
I don't know if that screen share went off. Does everybody see Kelsey Vanderbilt? Okay, perfect.
Joining me today are Robin Harris, Senior Associate Counsel, and David Jones, Deputy General Counsel. We're going to walk through the form changes the Texas Real Estate Commission adopted on November 4th. The red line versions of those forms are currently available on our website. On December 16th, Texas Realtors will be switching to the new forms on our website and through our form vendors. The previous versions of those forms will no longer be available for use through Texas Realtors Forms Library. This is well ahead of the TREC mandatory effective date of January 3rd. Let's start with the changes to the sales contracts. The following changes apply to the 1 to 4 family residential contract, the new home contract, both incomplete and completed construction, the residential condominium contract, and the farm and ranch contract, unless otherwise specified. Let's start with paragraph 4. Here, paragraph 4 is amended to add the term geothermal to the definition of natural resources leases because of a 2023 law change that stipulates property owners own the geothermal energy below the surface of their land and can drill or produce that energy and associated resources. Next is paragraph 6. In paragraph 6C1, to be consistent with the recently updated Texas Department of Insurance procedural rule, the paragraph is amended to include the option of providing the T47.1 declaration, which does not need to be notarized, and that's in lieu of the T47 affidavit when the seller furnishes the buyer an existing survey. While the T47.1 is available for use now through TDI's website, the current 1 to 4 family residential contract does not allow for the use of the T47.1. With the changes to the 1 to 4 contract, we will make the new T47.1 declaration available on the Texas Realtors website and through forms vendors on the same day as the other forms updates. Additionally, in lieu of providing a no survey required option, paragraph 6C2 is amended to read buyer may obtain a new survey instead of buyer shall obtain a new survey, and adds that if the buyer ultimately fails to obtain the survey, the buyer does not have the right to terminate the contract under paragraph 2B, the third-party financing addendum, because the survey was not obtained. Moving on to paragraph 6E11. Because Texas law requires a seller to provide a buyer a copy of any mold remediation certificate issued during the 5 years preceding the sale of the new property, paragraph 6E11 is added to provide information regarding this requirement. The unimproved property contract does not have this additional paragraph. Next is paragraph 6E12. Scrolling down to that. So paragraph 6E12 is modified to add specific examples of the types of notices that should be listed in the paragraph and to add a caution that seller's failure to provide required notices may provide buyer with certain remedies like the ability to terminate the contract. Next, we will move on to paragraph 12 with our settlement and other expenses. In light of new practice changes were made to paragraph 12 to allow for the seller to agree to pay buyer broker compensation within the contract. Paragraph 12A1A and 12A2 were amended to add that each party pays the brokerage fees that they have each agreed to pay. And in paragraph 12A1B, it was amended to allow for a specific seller contribution to buyer's brokerage fees. This paragraph creates an obligation for the seller to pay the buyer broker. Members should use this paragraph in the 1 to 4 family residential contract if the seller wants to pay the buyer broker directly. Using the compensation agreement between broker and owner, TXR 2401, and completing 12A1B could create a duplicate obligation. Paragraph 12A1C, that has been added to separately address other seller contributions. This was previously in paragraph 12A1B. The prior language that specified the order in which any contribution was to be paid, as well as the limitation on the type of fee that could be paid, is removed. And conforming changes were also made in the amendment to contract. Additionally, the compensation disclosure in the broker information section of the contracts, down here, find it right here. This was modified to remove the parenthetical referencing the MLS and to add check boxes to allow for the fee to be reflected either as a percentage or as a dollar amount. Those changes were made in all of the contracts except for the farm and ranch contract. So now I'll pass it to Robin, who will cover changes specific to the farm and ranch contract and the unimproved property contract.
Thanks, Kelsey. Hey everyone, so the next few changes we're going to talk about originally came directly from a farm and ranch task force that we had 2 years ago and forwarded to the broker lawyer committee for consideration. The recommendations were incorporated with this more recent round of updates. So first, let's look at the farm and ranch contract. That's TXR 1701. In addition to those changes that Kelsey detailed, the title of paragraph 20 is changed to federal requirements, and there's a new paragraph 20B, which provides information on the obligations related to the Federal Agriculture Foreign Investment Disclosure Act of 1978, which, among other things, requires foreign investors to report their involvement in U.S. agricultural land, whether that's a purchase or some kind of ownership interest. Failure to do so has significant penalties attached to it. So the committee wanted to make sure, and the commission to make sure that purchasers of these large tracts of lands are aware of the requirement and in compliance. Now, it's important to note that this notice language was not added to the unimproved property contract, but the same reporting requirements would apply if it was a large tract of unimproved agricultural land. Next, unimproved property contract, that's TXR 1607. In addition to those changes made to the sales contracts that Kelsey previously mentioned, the unimproved property contract adds paragraph 3D to include the same sales price adjustment language that's currently found in the farm and ranch contract. These adjustments would be used on large tracts of land that have an acreage variance after the survey is completed so that that price would be adjusted. Next is a new form. It's addendum for section 1031 exchange. It's going to be TXR 1956. The Broker Lawyer Committee drafted this addendum that allows the seller or buyer to disclose an intent to use the subject property as a 1031 exchange and includes a statement that the parties will reasonably cooperate with one another. The language is similar to what Texas Realtors has in our commercial contract, where 1031s are common, but the committee saw the rise in the financing option as in residential transactions and thought that a form would be appropriate. Providing this as an addendum rather than in the text of the contract allows the parties to use it when it's applicable without causing any unnecessary confusion. A reference to the new addendum for 1031 exchanges was also added to paragraph 22 of the contract. Next is the condominium resale certificate. That's TXR 1921. This is amended so that the language in paragraphs K and L match Texas Property Code section 82.157. The Broker Lawyer Committee policy for contracts and forms that they develop is that if the statute has language in it, then they're going to take that language and mirror it. For example, in the TREC version of the seller's disclosure, they only have what's in the statute. That's exactly what this change is, only mirroring that language in the statute so that it matches. Now, David will discuss the remaining changes that we have coming your way. David?
Thank you, Robin. So first, I will discuss the third-party financing addendum. There were several important revisions made to the third-party financing addendum. That's Form TXR 1901 in the Texas Realtors Library of Forms. The first change deals with how a buyer terminates under paragraph 2A when the buyer does not obtain buyer approval from the lender. And just as a reminder, buyer approval deals with a loan being approved or denied based on an issue with the buyer, such as the buyer's assets or income and their credit history. That's as opposed to a loan being denied because of an issue with the property, which is covered in paragraph 2B. So under the new language, for a buyer to terminate under paragraph 2A, buyer approval, the buyer must send a notice of termination, which is not new, and a buyer has to send a copy of a written statement from the lender setting forth the reason for the lender's determination. That's new, but this should sound familiar since this is the same requirement under paragraph 2B, property approval. So now you have paragraph 2A and 2B are consistent in that they both require, one, a notice of termination, and two, a written statement from the lender for the buyer to be able to terminate. The second change deals with paragraph 2B, property approval. The new language clarifies the deadline for a buyer to terminate if the lender denies the loan based on an issue with the property. Buyer must give the seller the notice of termination and the written statement from the lender on or before the third day before the closing date. Now, this deadline hasn't changed, okay? It's just that the previous way it was written was causing some confusions, okay? So this change is really just about clarity. So if you have a closing date, let's say is on a Friday, Thursday is 1 day before, Wednesday is 2 days before, and Tuesday is the third day before closing. So the buyer must terminate on or before Tuesday with a Friday closing, and that means sending in the notice of termination and the written statement from the lender. Now, the next contract I will discuss is the addendum for backup contract. Okay, and this is the final form that we'll be discussing today. That is TXR 1909. So in the truck, farm and ranch and residential sales contracts, so the 1-to-4 family, new home, condo, and unimproved properties, you have paragraph 5, where the buyer and seller agree to the amounts for earnest money and option fee. The changes to the backup addendum now allow the buyer and seller to agree to additional earnest money and option fee that will be delivered only when the backup contract becomes the primary contract. So now you can have one set of numbers to enter the contract originally, then additional money only if the backup contract becomes primary. The provisions regarding issues such as timing of when to pay earnest money and option fee and the consequences for not paying the additional earnest money and option fee, that language mirrors what's already in paragraph 5 in the initial contract. Okay, so you have that automatic extension if the last day to deliver the earnest money option fee falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. The deadline is automatically extended to the next day that's not Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. Any amount received by the escrow agent gets applied first to the additional option fee, then to the additional earnest money. The escrow agent is authorized to release the additional option fee to the seller at any time without further notice or consent. If the buyer fails to timely deliver the additional earnest money, the seller may terminate the contract or use their remedies under paragraph 15. And if the buyer fails to timely deliver the additional option fee, the buyer doesn't have the option to terminate. One question that comes up with this change is, well, can you put 0 as the initial earnest money and option fee in paragraph 5 of the sales contract and only put money for additional earnest money and option fee in the backup contract when it becomes the primary contract? Well, it's not recommended to have 0 as either the initial earnest money or the option fee. For the initial earnest money, you don't have to have earnest money for an effective contract, right? The earnest money is not the consideration. But I would imagine that a seller would probably want the buyer to have some skin in the game to sign the initial contract. And for the option fee, well, paragraph 5D of the sales contract specifically says, if no dollar amount is stated as the option fee, the buyer shall not have the unrestricted right to terminate the contract. So probably not a good idea to have 0 dollar amount for the initial earnest money and option fee, trying to save everything just for the additional earnest money in the backup contract. And with that, I will turn things over back to Kelsey.
All right. Thank you, Robin and David. To recap, the red line versions of these forms are currently available on our website. The updated forms will be available on the Texas Realtors website and through our forms vendors on December 16th. And additionally, the addendum regarding brokers' fees, TXR 2406, and the amendment to representation agreement, TXR 2701, will no longer be available starting December 16th. If you have any questions about these forms changes, please contact the Texas Realtors Legal Hotline at 512-480-8200. Thanks for listening.
All right. So, really good
If you're
bid
thinking of selling your house,
by TXR. To recap what they said, T47.1 declaration is basically like the T47 affidavit, but it does not need to be notarized. Okay, they're allowing that to happen. The other thing that's pretty big is paragraph 12A1 of the third-party financing addendum. Whenever a buyer pulls out based off their credit worthiness, buyer approval, as long as they terminate within the time frame that's in that addendum, they get their earnest money back and everybody's fine. Previously, that addendum did not require the buyer to have a letter from the lender, right? So the listing agent always was like, well, are you guys just wanting to terminate because you got cold feet here, or can you really not get the loan? Now we're going to have some clarity because now it requires a letter from the lender stating forth why they determined that the buyer's approval did not happen. So that's awesome. Other than that, we are going to record this and send it out to everybody. And we're going to learn this. We're going to get real good at it. And then they're going to make changes again, ladies and gentlemen. And we're going to learn those and get real good at those too. And this is always about adjusting and learning. But I am very well positive, and I'm hoping that this will be the way we're going to proceed in this NAR settlement practice change. I love that they put in paragraph 12 that we can bind the seller to pay us directly in the contract. That's what we needed. We need it. It's the tool that we needed to navigate this type of market now. So it's a great tool. You know, a lot of the times the buyers don't have the money. The lenders got their entire life savings and their firstborn child and 2 pints of blood, and they say, hey, I can't afford this. Can you make it a part of negotiations? And we can do it now with a little bit of clarity to them instead of addendum regarding broker's fees, which confuses them. So we've got some good stuff here moving forward. We just need to get better at it. We're always going to get sharp in our craft. But I'm going to wrap it up. Does anybody have any other questions?
I have a question, but not everybody's going to care. It's about that 1031 exchange.
Yeah.
I could ask it later if you want.
No, go right ahead.
I'm wondering, what's the strategy? Why do we have to do that? Like, is there, because I might be using that sometime. I always thought like that's really none of this. Like, if the buyer is buying it with a 1031, why does the seller need to know? Because if the seller thinks, oh, this is a business, then they might negotiate for a higher price, you know? Like, I feel like it's not good to tell them, like, I don't understand, why are we having to, and do we have to tell them it's a 1031?
Well, you got to disclose it to them, yes. But in that form, from what I read from it, it says that they're both agreeing to work together. And I think the reason that they put it together is sellers weren't working with buyers on 1031s and buyers weren't working with sellers on 1031s as far as being amicable on giving each other documentation or whatever they needed to do to make it happen with the 1031 tax exchange attorneys to put everything together. So within that form, it kind of just says, hey guys, be grown-ups, don't get spiteful, and work together on this. I'll have to call TXR and get a little bit more clarity on as far as, do we need to disclose it? You know, it is something that was in the original 104 that was just a checkbox. But I don't see how that would really hinder the semantics of the real estate transaction. You know, all it is a deferment. They're going to take it down no matter what anyways. So, and we really don't.
I guess it's because, now I'm thinking of it, I think it's because there's a time requirement on the 1031 and maybe people were taking too long and then the other person lost it. Maybe this gives you an ability to sue somebody if they take too long with their documents.
Yeah, maybe, or maybe it's just slapping everybody on the wrist and saying, hey, let's work together here, you know, help the buyer do their 1031, help the seller do their 1031. They did bring you an offer, or they are selling you their property. That's kind of what I got from the form, Kristen.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? All right, guys. Well, Happy New Year, Merry Christmas. We're going to thrive in 2025. We are ripe to just start kicking some butt in the spring season, and right now is a great time to start going out there and capturing those spring listings and getting ready and showing everybody that just because they'd had some NAR settlement changes and they took one little field out of MLS, it doesn't change our fiduciary responsibility and how we take care of people. So I'm proud of you guys. Thanks for your participation today. We're going to email everybody this. And if there's any other form changes, we're going to get together like this and we're going to make sure everybody's on point. Appreciate it, ladies and gentlemen. You'll have a great week. And if you need anything, don't hesitate to give us a call.
Thanks, Chiaki. Have a
Thank
good
you.
one.
Jackie.
No problem.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.